Hey guys, tonight we step through the creaking doors of a place where the floor is never really clean, the air smells like a stew of tobacco and regret, and the piano hasn't been tuned since Lincoln was president. You're standing in the middle of a Wild West saloon and wooden wallboards under your boots, a dusty bar stretching across the room, and a spittoon uncomfortably close to the dining area. Oh, and don't lean against the walls, they're mostly splinters and probably someone's blood from last Tuesday. You came for a drink, maybe a bite to eat, but what you'll find here is a whole buffet of questionable choices. And I'll just say this now, you probably won't survive this. Not the gunfight, not the gamble, not the griddle-fried rat meat that someone is definitely passing off as prairie chicken. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough to interact, post your location and local time in the comments. Helps us see who else is wandering the Wild West tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The moment you walk into the saloon, you notice the unmistakable blend of smells: beer-soaked wood, overcooked meat, unwashed bodies, and that faint undertone of old cheese. There's a haze in the air, not smoke exactly, more like history clinging to the beams. A man in the corner snores loudly with his face down on a table, surrounded by empty mugs and crusts of bread that may or may not be from this decade. A piano player thumps out a tired tune, looking like he gave up on hope halfway through the third chord. Welcome to dinner. But before we talk food, let's talk furniture. The tables are mismatched, like they were each stolen from a different tavern. The chairs wobble dangerously or are missing a leg. Most customers just lean against the bar instead of risking a fall, especially after a few whiskies. The bar counter itself is a piece of pine worn so smooth from elbows, spilled beer and flying teeth that it gleams in the lantern light. Behind it, bottles of bourbon, rye, and something brown in a jar line the shelves. If you're lucky, there might be a pot of beans bubbling somewhere nearby. If you're unlucky, that pot has been bubbling since last week. Now, Wild West saloons weren't all one-size-fits-all. In mining towns, you might find 20 saloons on a single stretch of muddy street, each one competing for customers with louder music, cheaper booze, or the bold promise of fresh bread. Some saloons, believe it or not, were more like proto-restaurants. They offered dining rooms and menus with actual printed words if the owner was feeling fancy. Others didn't bother. Food was whatever the bartender could scrape together or convince the cook, who doubled as the janitor, to fry up in a pan. And yes, there were cooks, usually grizzled veterans of the Civil War, widowers with questionable hygiene, or someone whose other career paths had all ended in gunfire. They worked in tiny kitchens with roaring fires, cast iron pots and dull knives. The smell of lard was constant. Lard in the biscuits, lard in the stew, lard in your dreams later that night. There were no refrigerators, obviously. Meat was salted or smoked. Vegetables were, well, theoretical. And food safety? That was just a fancy way of saying, hope you don't die. Here's your first mainstream fact of the night. One of the most commonly served meals in Wild West saloons was beans and bacon, sometimes known as cowboy beans. This hearty mix was cheap, filling, and didn't spoil too quickly. Bacon, preserved in salt and packed in barrels, was one of the few meats that could survive a journey out west. Beans, dry, light, and nearly indestructible. Throw them in a pot with water and pork fat and boom, you've got something that... Add coffee so strong it can remove paint, and you've got a cowboy's complete food pyramid. But let's go weirder. Here's your unusual tidbit. In some higher-end saloons, especially those trying to appeal to railroad men or visiting dignitaries, you could order mock turtle soup. Now, if you're thinking that sounds elegant, you're not wrong. This dish was inspired by real turtle soup, a delicacy on the East Coast. But out west, where actual turtles were not lining up to be served, that's right, you're sipping hot, briny brain broth while pretending you're a fancy gentleman. The illusion only lasts until someone drops their revolver in the pot. And here's the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that saloons were the first restaurants of the frontier, providing more than just drinks and gambling, offering a place for weary travellers to sit, eat and socialise. Others say that's generous. They claim most saloons were glorified bars, with food as an afterthought tossed on the menu to keep the sheriff happy or soak up the whiskey. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. There were upscale places in cities like Dodge or Denver, where you could order lamb chops or oysters, yes, oysters, shipped in barrels of ice. But in your average boomtown, if the food was warm and didn't move, you called it dinner. Now back to the visual. Imagine sitting on a creaky bench, bowl of steaming stew in your hands, watching a brawl erupt near the card table while someone else sings off key. Your spoon is bent, your biscuit is so dense it could qualify as a building material, and there's a fly doing laps around your head. But you eat anyway, because this is dinner, and you haven't seen anything green since you left St. Louis. Some folks brought their own food, especially if they were travelling with families. They might unwrap cloth bundles of cornbread, dried sausage or preserved fruit, what we call trail food today. Others relied entirely on what the saloon could offer. That meant a menu built around what was cheap, shelf-stable and easy to cook in bulk. You didn't get options, you got stew. Or you didn't eat. And yet there's a strange charm to it. The grit, the clatter, the smell of burnt coffee and gun oil. It was a time when every meal was both a risk and a ritual. You shared benches with gamblers, outlaws, preachers and fortune seekers. You swapped stories over bowls of beans and slices of questionable pie. And if you were lucky, the cook wouldn't sneeze directly into the pot that night. As you finish your imaginary plate, wiping your mouth with the back of your sleeve like a true frontier pro, you lean back and listen to the ambient noise of spoons clinking, boots scuffing, and distant laughter. The food might not be good, but the memories stick to your ribs. Just like the lard. You're still seated at that sticky saloon table, your bowl scraped clean, even though you're not entirely convinced it was food you just ate. The lantern overhead swings gently, casting crooked shadows across the warped floorboards. In the background, the piano wheezes out a half-hearted tune while someone nearby argues over a hand of cards, likely cheating and deftly losing. It's loud, smoky, and smells vaguely like wet leather and singed molasses, which means it's dinner time in the Wild West. Let's dive into the daily menu. The average saloon wasn't exactly known for its culinary range, but there were staples, and they were served with the kind of consistency only found in stubborn men and government bureaucracy. Chief among them, beans. Baked, boiled, fried, or mushed into something resembling a paste. You could walk into just about any watering hole from Kansas to California and be guaranteed a plate of beans, a side of bacon, and some form of bread, or something pretending to be bread. Add a tin cup of black coffee and congratulations, you've just ordered the Wild West tasting menu. Beans weren't just cheap, they were durable. You could store dried beans in a sack for months, even years, without them spoiling. And since refrigeration was still just a rich man's fantasy, this made beans an obvious go-to. A big pot could simmer all day behind the bar, picking up flavour, or at least mystery, or from whatever else got tossed in. Some saloons even had a permanent bean pot, never fully emptied, just toot off every morning like some kind of terrifying way. If the idea of day-old stew weirds you out, just remember, here it could be week-old beans, aged like fine wine, or possibly weaponized compost. Now for the meat. Bacon reigns supreme. Not the thin, crispy kind you know and love, but thick, fatty slabs of pork belly salted beyond all reason. Preservation was key, and the saltiness? That was the point. It wasn't meant to taste good. It was meant to survive the journey from back east without turning into a science experiment. Cowboys would often refer to it as sow belly, which somehow makes it sound even less appetizing, if that's possible. And yes, some nights you might get lucky and score something better, like steak or ham. But most of the time, meat meant bacon. Or, in slightly more sketchy establishments, mystery meat. If it looked like beef but chewed like shoe leather, it might have been horse. If it smelled fishy but had fur, best not to ask. The less you questioned, the more satisfied you pretended to be. Here's your historical fact. Black coffee was a defining feature of nearly every meal in the West. Made with ground beans boiled directly in a pot, ground and all, it was served in dented tin mugs that burned your fingers and tasted like last night's poker game. Still, it was hot, it kept you awake, and it kept your digestive system guessing. Some saloons would serve cold drinks like milk or cider if you were in a more established town, but for the most part, if you wanted something other than coffee or whiskey, you were met with a blank stare and a long silence. Water wasn't always safe, beer was hit or miss depending on how far it had travelled, and soda pop, that was still making its way out west. And now, the unusual tidbit. Some saloons served canned oysters. Yes, oysters. In the desert. In mining towns where water was scarce and people hadn't seen the ocean since childhood, you could walk into a saloon and order a tin of oysters, preserved, packed in brine, and shipped hundreds of miles by train or mule. It sounds absurd, but they were considered a delicacy, a treat, something to impress your poker buddies or woo a dance hall girl, and yes, people actually ate them. Some even survived. Of course, canned goods were expensive. A can of oysters might cost a day's wages or more, but when you struck gold, or just lied about it, you celebrated with something special. For the unlucky, there were always pickled eggs, stale biscuits, and a lukewarm beer to round out the dining experience. This brings us to our scholarly debate of the evening. Did saloon food actually taste bad, or are we just judging it by modern standards? Some historians believe that frontier cooking, while simple, was flavorful in its own way, heavily seasoned, slow-cooked, and spiced with what little was available. Others argue that taste was irrelevant. The goal was fuel. You weren't eating for pleasure. You were eating to stay upright through a cattle drive, a gunfight, or a 16-hour shift in the silver mine. The truth? Probably both. A good saloon cook could work wonders with onions, salt pork, and elbow grease. A bad one could ruin a boiled potato. Speaking of potatoes, they were another staple. If you were near any sort of farmland or trade route, you probably saw a boiled or fried potato now and then, mashed if the cook was in a romantic mood. But often they were just roasted and tossed onto your plate like a hot rock with seasoning. Onion was the most common vegetable, and sometimes... Let's not forget bread. And I use the term loosely. Cornbread, hard biscuits, and jonny cakes made up the holy trinity of Western carbs. They were dense, dry, and often baked into whatever shape the cook's cast iron skillet dictated. Texture was challenging. You didn't bite through a saloon biscuit so much as negotiate with it. You lean back again at your imaginary table, wiping the grease from your lips. Somewhere nearby, a miner is choking on his beans, and a saloon girl walks past with a tray of bottles and a look that says she's seen everything. You glance at the bar, where a newcomer is inspecting his meal with the same expression you might reserve for a taxidermy exhibit. He takes a bite. He doesn't die. That's the only 5-star review this place will ever get. Let's be clear. There were some saloons that tried to raise the bar, so to speak. Fancier joints in booming cities might have actual menus with French words, red check tablecloths, and chefs who knew the difference between boiling and burning. But for most frontier folk, food wasn't about luxury, it was about necessity. You came in, paid your Congo, and hoped the meat wasn't still twitching. Evenings in the saloon weren't complete without dessert, though that word's doing a lot of heavy lifting. We'll get into the more shocking sweets later, but for now, imagine being offered a chunk of dried apple pie with no sugar, no crust, and no apologies. Or maybe you'd get a square of molasses cake that had the consistency of a brick and the sweetness of a cactus. You smiled, you ate it, and you chased it with more coffee or... That was just life. It just haunts you. Morning in the Wild West doesn't creep in gently. It barges through the cracks in the wall with a blast of sun, the stench of livestock, and the sound of someone vomiting behind the saloon. You slept, if you can call it that, on a lumpy cot, or maybe the barroom floor, wrapped in your duster, your hat over your face, and one eye open in case anyone got clever with your boots. Now it's breakfast, which in this place means, well, food. Probably. You rise with your back aching and your stomach already grumbling, and you stagger toward the counter. The bartender hasn't even opened his other eye yet, and the cook looks like he's fighting a war with the skillet. You don't ask what's on the menu. You ask if there's a menu, and you do it real polite, because the answer might involve a ladle to the face. Let's talk about breakfast, the most important meal of the day, especially if the rest of your day might involve cattle rustlers, stagecoach robbers, or dysentery. Cowboys and saloon regulars didn't have the luxury of sleeping in and reading the paper. A lot of folks were already up before dawn, especially the working types. Ranchers, miners, and trail drivers had been awake for hours, doing hard labor while your bones were still negotiating with graft. Enter the cowboy breakfast. No, it didn't come with avocado toast. It came with bacon, beans, and bread. Again. Sometimes eggs if there was a chicken around that hadn't been eaten in a bar fight. Eggs were a luxury, and they weren't always fresh. You'd get a couple fried in lard because butter was as rare as common sense, and if you were especially fortunate, there might be a slice of salt pork on the side. This wasn't a balanced meal, it was a survival kit. One mainstream historical fact: cowboys on the trail often started their days with sourdough biscuits cooked over open fires in Dutch ovens. These biscuits, made from starter dough that had to be kept alive and passed around like a sacred artifact, were a point of pride for trail cooks. They were crusty, dense, and slightly tangy from fermentation. In a saloon, though, sourdough was hit or miss. The cook might have inherited a starter passed down from a San Francisco bakery, or he might have started his own yesterday using flour, water, and hope. Either way, the biscuits came out steaming, uneven, and sometimes with a surprise crunch. That surprise? Often gravel, or both. Now for something unusual. There's record of some saloons serving fried mush. Mush cornmeal porridge that's been cooled, sliced, and fried in fat until crispy. Sounds kind of nice, right? Like a rustic hash brown? Well, it was popular not because of its taste, but because it was dirt cheap. Cornmeal was plentiful, filling, and could be stretched into multiple meals. Some folks would drizzle it with molasses if it was available. Others would douse it in gravy made from bacon drippings. Either way, it was like eating crunchy mud. Comforting in its own gritty way. There were also flapjacks, thick pan-fried cakes made with flour, salt, and water. Occasionally you'd get syrup. More likely you'd get a grim nod from the cook and a pat of lard, pretending to be butter. If you wanted them sweet, you brought your own sugar, which was basically gold out here, so yeah. And now, the scholarly debate. Did people in the Old West actually eat breakfast in saloons? Or is that just something movies made up? Some researchers argue that most meals were eaten at home or in boarding houses, and saloons only served booze and quick bites to lonely men without kitchens. But others point to traveller accounts, newspaper ads and diary entries that describe saloons serving morning meals. The most likely answer? Both. In frontier towns with limited options, saloons filled multiple roles. Some were nothing more than watering holes, others offered full meals, often starting at dawn. If you were lucky, the place had a real kitchen. You glanced down at your imaginary plate. Greasy biscuit, smoked bacon, coffee so dark it might be absorbing light. It's not gourmet, but it's hot. And if you're eating this, you probably survive the night. You soak your biscuit in the coffee like you've seen the old-timers do. It helps soften it. Also disguises the flavour. One bite later, your jaw cracks audibly, but you push through. That's the frontier spirit, or wine spread. Most breakfast foods were flavoured with pork fat, onions, or nothing at all. You seasoned with grit, literally. And once you'd eaten enough, you didn't taste much anyway. Your tongue was too busy surviving. A fun side note. Molasses was sometimes used as a sweetener when sugar was too pricey. Cowboys might swirl a bit into their coffee or drizzle it onto cornbread. It added a deep, earthy sweetness. If you could get past the texture, I mean tar. The stuff was thick, sticky, and often came with its own ecosystem if left out too long. And for those lucky enough to be near a river or rail line, maybe, you'd get fresh milk with your breakfast, but it had to be used fast. Without refrigeration, milk went from okay to liquid gamble in a matter of hours. Most folks passed. Others took their chances. Some regretted it immediately. As breakfast winds down, the saloon begins to buzz. The early drinkers filter in, because it's 5 o'clock somewhere, and in the West, nobody had a watch. The card tables get wiped off with a rag that looks like it fought in a war. The bartender refills the coffee, pouring directly from the pot into mugs that are still warm from yesterday's use. You nod at the cook on your way out. He doesn't nod back. He's too busy swatting flies and cursing at the biscuit pan. Your belly is full of something, and the day has officially begun. Maybe you'll herd cattle, maybe you'll dig silver, or maybe you'll come right back here in an hour for lunch, because that coffee has already evacuated your insides. Welcome to breakfast, cowboy style. Chew hard, sip slow, and if the eggs are green, don't ask questions. Your boots thump down the rickety saloon steps, sun now fully up, casting harsh light across the dusty street. The morning fog of beans and bad decisions is just beginning to clear, but you're already thinking about your next meal. That's the funny thing about saloon food. It sticks with you emotionally more than physically. It might linger in your mind, but your stomach still feels like it's running on fumes. And just when you're ready to swear off all food west of the Mississippi forever, someone says something that stops you cold. They're serving turtle soup today. Wait, what? Mock turtle soup, to be precise. Which, if you're picturing some dignified chef carefully slicing a she-turtle like a fine roast. No, put that thought away. Turtles were never on the guest list. What you got was something inspired by turtle soup. A distant, slightly deranged cousin. And the main ingredients? Calf's head, tongue, and occasionally brains all simmered down into a brownish grain broth with herbs, boiled eggs, and the faint ghost of actual flesh. This was 1800s culinary cosplay at its most ambitious. Let's be clear, this dish had aspirations. It wanted to be fancy. It was the Wild West's idea of high-end dining. If your saloon served mock turtle soup, it was telling you, we're not just a whiskey shack, we're a restaurant. With illusions. The kind of place where they might have mismatched cutlery and napkins that didn't double as shirt sleeves. A place that catered to the newly rich, the railroad barons, or that one guy who hit a silver vein and couldn't wait to show off by buying soup with extra tongue. Here's your mainstream fact. Mock turtle soup wasn't just a Western oddity. It was originally invented in 18th century England as a cheaper alternative to green turtle soup, which had been a delicacy among the upper class. When it made its way to America, it gained traction fast, especially in places where turtle was, let's say, inconveniently absent. The American West took this already questionable dish and made it even more rustic. Bones and brains weren't just accepted, they were expected. If it didn't jiggle when served, it wasn't authentic. And now for the truly unusual. Some versions of mock turtle soup served in frontier saloons included sherry. Yes, alcohol. A splash of sherry wine was often added toward the end of the cooking process, partly to give the illusion of European sophistication, and partly to distract your taste buds from the fact that you were eating boiled face. Nothing like a bowl of brain broth with a boozy afterburn to get your appetite confused. But here's where things get murky, and we wade into tonight's scholarly debate. Was mock turtle soup actually popular in Western saloons, or is its presence exaggerated by historical menus designed for show? Some historians believe that saloons, especially in booming towns like San Francisco or Denver, offered mock turtle soup as a status symbol. It showed that you were part of civilization, even out here in the dust and gunpowder. But others argue that it was more of a gimmick, something listed on the chalkboard to impress out-of-towners, or used sparingly for special occasions, when someone important was in town and expected a taste of refinement. Honestly, it's a toss-up. It's likely that saloons with a bit of extra ambition tried to serve dishes like this to distinguish themselves, and sometimes the cook had no idea what he was doing. Which brings us to one tragic but oddly common occurrence: surprise ingredients. If calf's head wasn't available, substitutions were made. Maybe goat, maybe pig, maybe something that wandered too close to the kitchen while the cook was sharpening his knife. You didn't ask, you just sopped up the broth with a chunk of crusty bread and prayed that whatever animal it came from hadn't recently been someone's pet. There was a strange dignity in it, though. These dishes, strange, stretchy, strange smelling, were a nod to the old world, to what folks left behind. Emigrants from Europe, especially the British and Irish, brought these recipes with them. They were reminders of home, dressed up in Wild West desperation. A little cultural memory served in a chipped bowl under flickering lamplight, with a spoon that had survived 5 owners and 2 bar fights. Imagine you're back inside the saloon now, holding one of those bowls. The soup is steaming, the broth thick and brown, the chunks of unidentifiable meat floating like ancient relics. There's a boiled egg cut in half, bobbing near the surface like it's trying to escape. You take a sip. It's warm, salty, heavy. The kind of meal that makes your jaw do all the work and your stomach sign a waiver. You can taste onion, maybe parsley, and definitely some sort of alcohol trying its best to cover up the livestock notes. Across the table, a man with a long beard and a shorter temper is doing the same. He's not talking. No one is. Because once mock turtle soup is served, all joking stops. It's a meal that commands respect. Or at least, silence. And now a fun callback. Remember those beans from earlier? Some saloons would actually toss leftover beans into the soup pot the next day. Nothing was wasted. A scoop of mock turtle, a ladle of cowboy beans, a dash of pepper, and congratulations. You've created something no one's ever seen before, and hopefully never will again. It's like culinary jazz. Improvised, unpredictable, slightly dangerous. Dessert afterward. If your insides weren't already planning a mutiny, you might get a slice of pie. Not the fruity flaky kind, more like vinegar pie, which we'll get into later. For now, just know that if it didn't come from a can or a sack, it probably came from someone's dreams. Or nightmare. As the soup settles in your stomach like a rock with a law degree, you sit back and let the saloon return to its usual rhythm. Boots clunk, spoons clatter, someone yells at the piano player for playing the same song 3 times in a row, and he flips them off without missing a note. The air smells like soup, sweat, and the overwhelming urge to reconsider your life choices. But here's the thing. Mock turtle soup, weird as it was, represented something that mattered out here. Trying. Even in a place where most meals came in tins and hygiene was optional, there were cooks who tried to make food taste like home, or at least taste like something other than salt and soot. It was a strange, ambitious, occasionally repulsive dish that, for a few moments, made you feel like you were part of something a little more refined than the daily scramble for survival. And honestly, that's worth something. So the next time someone offers you a steaming bowl of Wild West mock turtle soup, just nod, take a spoonful, and smile. Because no matter what it tastes like, you're tasting history. You've had the beans, you've survived the mock turtle soup, you've soaked your cornbread in coffee and contemplated whether that biscuit was meant for human consumption or to patch a hole in the wall. But just when you think saloon cuisine can't get any more experimental, the cook clatters out of the kitchen carrying something that looks like it was chiseled out of a chalkboard. Welcome to the realm of hardtack. Now, if you've never had the pleasure of biting into hardtack, imagine chewing drywall, except the drywall fights back. This isn't bread, it's a survival tactic. It's what happens when you mix flour and water, forget every rule of baking, and then deliberately ignore flavour. No yeast, no salt, just the barest minimum needed to call it food. And it was everywhere in the Old West. Hardtack wasn't just served in saloons, it was a staple of military rations, long wagon journeys, and mining camps. These tooth-busting biscuits were baked until rock hard, often twice, to suck out any remaining moisture. Why? Because moisture meant mould, and mould meant mould, death. Hardtack was made to last. In fact, there are surviving pieces from the Civil War that still exist today. Not that anyone should eat them, unless you've lost a bet. Here's your historical fact for the night. Hardtack had so little moisture and fat content that it could be stored for years. Soldiers and pioneers carried sacks of it across the country, and saloons, especially those that doubled as boarding houses, kept it in barrels behind the bar, sometimes wrapped in old cloth or stuffed into wooden crates. If you were lucky, it had softened just enough from the humility to chew. If you weren't, you needed a hammer, or at least very forgiving teeth. But that's just the start. Hardtack wasn't the only wise this edible item on the menu. Let's talk about jerky, strips of dried meat that were either salted, smoked, or just left out in the sun until bacteria got bored and left. Jerky was popular because it was portable and tough, and by tough I mean rhinoceroid tough. You didn't bite jerky, you gnawed at it, you knived at it, like a dog with a bone. Some cowboys tied it to their saddle horns and let it flap in the wind for a few hours to soften up. Others soaked it in coffee or whiskey before eating. Either way, it was more commitment than snack. And now, your unusual tidbit. One of the strangest yet real food items served in frontier towns was canned bread. Yes, bread in a can. Baked inside the can itself, this spongy loaf slid out like a pale, bread-flavoured jellyfish. Often used in emergencies or imported from industrial bakeries back east, canned bread was a marvel of modern food science. Many thought it unnatural. Others embraced it as a sign that maybe the future wasn't entirely hopeless. It was served sliced, often fried in lard, and passed off as soft biscuits. The taste? Somewhere between sadness and wallpaper paste. And then there were the tragic attempts at potato substitutes. Real potatoes were seasonal, bulky, and prone to rotting. So saloon kitchens sometimes leaned into root vegetables like turnips or rutabagas. Cheap, ugly, and willing to impersonate anything you told them to. Mashed rutabaga, pretend mashed potatoes. Fried turnip slices, faux potato chips. Most patrons didn't know. Now for tonight's scholarly debate. Was hardtack meant to be eaten as is, or always softened first? Historians are divided. Some argue it was intended to be eaten dry. Still, there are stories of soldiers and cowboys gnawing on it raw, sometimes breaking teeth, sometimes using knives to shave it down to bite-sized fragments. One account describes using a rifle butt to smash hardtack against a rock. Romantic dining it was not, but if there's one universal truth, it's this. No one liked hardtack. They ate it because they had to, and maybe because it was the one food that couldn't lie to you. It didn't pretend to be flavorful. It didn't come with garnish. It was honest, blunt, and unapologetically indestructible, just like the people who ate it. You imagine yourself back at the saloon table, staring at the small wooden board placed in front of you. It holds a slab of jerky, a square of hardtack, and a tiny ceramic bowl of what might be gravy, might be stew, or might just be melted fat. You try the jerky first. It resists you like a strip of leather. The hardtack is next. You dip it in the gravy and wait. It softens slightly, maybe. You take a bite and immediately regret every decision that led you to this moment. Across the room, a grizzled miner chomps his hardtack in rhythm with the piano. He's missing 3 teeth, and you wonder if that's a coincidence. He smiles at you. You don't smile back. You're too busy trying to remember if you paid your dental bill this month. In some saloons, there were efforts to make these edible mistakes more palatable. Dried fruits were chopped into the dough. Spices, when available, were added. Lard. It was about permanence. And let's not forget the accompanying drinks. You couldn't choke down a slab of hardtack without something to wash it down. That usually meant black coffee, weak beer, or watered-down whiskey. Water alone was dangerous. In many places it carried diseases or came from questionable wells that doubled as bathtubs for the local livestock. So coffee was boiled within an inch of its life, beer was brewed locally and badly, and whiskey was, well, whiskey, sometimes flavoured with tobacco or gunpowder for extra kick. Totally safe. To round out the misery, you might get a bowl of mush, hot cornmeal porridge, unseasoned and sad, or a slice of cold cornbread so dry it absorbed ambient sound. If you were lucky, someone had dropped a spoonful of honey into your portion. If you were unlucky, the honey turned out to be lamp oil. It was that kind of place. As the meal ends, you push your plate away, heartburn already kicking in. You lean back, eyeing the cracks in the saloon ceiling and wondering how many souls have sat right where you are, jaw sore, stomach full of sawdust and regret. The lantern above flickers, the bar creaks. The cook returns to the kitchen, scraping leftover hardtack crumbs into a bucket probably labelled future stew. And you smile. Because as terrible as that was, it was kind of perfect. You didn't come here for fine dining. You came here for the experience, the history, the honesty, and the joy of knowing that no matter what's on your plate today, it's still better than hardtack. Probably. The evening wears on. The saloon grows louder, thicker with noise, drink, and a slow fog of wood smoke and body odour. You've just survived a plate of hardtack and jerky, a dining experience that felt more like a dare than a meal. But as you slump in your chair, groaning softly with the fullness of a stomach lined with regret, something stews in the air, literally. A scent wafts from the kitchen, rich, smoky, and utterly unidentifiable. It's the scent of game meat, boiled bones, and desperation. This is no fancy soup. This is the infamous saloon mystery stew. Every Wild West saloon worth its creaky floorboards had a stew pot, sometimes iron, sometimes copper, always enormous and only bubbling. Some historians joke that it was less of a pot and more of a cauldron collective memory, a dish that never truly emptied, only evolved. Today's stew might include leftovers from yesterday's rabbit, last week's beef scraps, and if the supply wagon was late, you approach the counter and the cook ladles out a bowl of thick, murky goodness. There's no menu, no explanation. It's just stew. Could be venison, could be prairie dog, could be something the dog dragged in. All that matters is it's hot and somewhat chewable. Let's dive into this culinary chaos. The base of a mystery stew was always the same: water, bones and fat. Throw in whatever meat was on hand, thicken it with flour or cornmeal, and season it with salt if you had any left. Then you let it simmer, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. As new ingredients were added, old ones dissolved into the broth. It was a perpetual meal, like a sourdough starter but more chaotic and often sentient. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. Wild game was a regular ingredient in frontier stews. Deer, elk, rabbit and even buffalo made their way into saloon kitchens, particularly in areas with nearby hunting grounds. These meats were lean, plentiful and for gelatinous texture, let's say. But this is the West, and things rarely go smoothly. Which brings us to tonight's unusual tidbit. Some stews included rattlesnake. Yes, snake meat. Light, tender, and said to taste like chicken if you closed your eyes and stopped crying. Rattlesnakes were common in dry, scrubby areas, and enterprising cooks didn't let a little venom stand in the way of a meal. Skinned, boiled, and heavily seasoned rattlesnake stew was both a survival food and a local brag. Some saloons even advertised it on signs out front, with claims like, "Snake stew 10 cents, guaranteed fresh," which is both ambitious and disturbing. And if you think rattlesnake was wild, just wait. Prairie dog, armadillo, possum all made appearances in mystery stew, especially during lean seasons. Some cooks even tossed in cactus pats, napalus, or wild onions for texture. It was part science, part gamble. You didn't ask what was in the stew, you asked how long it had been cooking. Now for your scholarly debate. Were saloon stews deliberately vague, or were they just practical? Some researchers suggest the mystery aspect of saloon stew was intentional, a way to avoid complaints by never specifying ingredients. If a customer didn't know what he was eating, he couldn't accuse the cook of lying. Others argue the mystery came from sheer necessity. Cooks used what they had, with no illusions or secrets. If it walked, crawled, or flew into town, it might end up in the pot. Truth be told, both are probably accurate, and either way, you ate it, because it was warm and filling and didn't bite back. Usually, you raise your spoon and dip it into your steaming bowl. The broth is thick and brownish, the scent a medley of meat, salt, and mystery. Floating on top is something fibrous, maybe a strip of meat, maybe a very confident vegetable. You take a bite. The texture is chewy, the flavour is complex. That's a polite word for strange, but strangely good. Across the table, a man slurps his stew loudly and mutters, "Pretty sure this one's got squirrel." He seems pleased. You nod as if that's something worth celebrating. Another patron leans in and says, "I had gopher once. Boiled till the bones melted. Tasted like sadness." Then he grins. Everyone here has a story about stew. Here's something else to note. Bones were part of the experience. Most stew bowls came with the occasional rib, vertebra, or jaw fragment. Picking meat off bones with your fingers was expected. Utensils were optional, and if you found a tooth in your bowl, well, hopefully it wasn't yours. Vegetables were rare but present. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, or wild parsnips were sometimes chopped in. Dried beans or lentils helped thicken the mix. Occasionally dried apples were thrown in, not for sweetness, but because they plumped up and filled space. Some stews had barley, oats, or even rice if the town had access to trade goods, but more often than not, the bulk came from leftover biscuit chunks or day-old cornbread, crumpled into the pot like sacrificial offering. The thing is, mystery stew wasn't just food, it was ritual. The bubbling pot sat in the same place every day. It was the constant in a town full of shifting alliances, broken promises, and sudden shootouts. You could always come back to the stew. It didn't judge. It didn't change. It just waited. One barkeep in Arizona reportedly named his pot Old Reliable. It had been boiling for 3 years straight. Ingredients changed daily, but the broth, the essence, remained. Locals swore it cured hangovers, colds, and marital disputes. One man even claimed he saw God halfway through his 3rd bowl. Others claimed he just fainted from the salt. A callback for fun. Remember that canned oysters from earlier? Some saloons, especially those trying to show off, would toss a few oysters into the stew on special occasions. The result? Something that smelled expensive but tasted confusing. Still, it earned points for novelty. Oyster and rabbit stew sounds like something a modern chef might try to deconstruct on a reality show. Back then, it was just... And sometimes, if you were really lucky, you'd get meat from a wild turkey or duck. These birds were harder to catch, but their meat was tender and flavourful. If a hunter brought one in, the saloon would make a special batch of stew that night. Folks would line up for a bowl, knowing it wouldn't happen again for months. The cook would toss in herbs, maybe some sage, maybe even gonacum. But the next day, the magic was gone. The pot went back to normal: raccoon tail, bone shards, a hint of onion, and something that might be turnip, but might also be... As you finish your bowl, the warmth spreading through your limbs, you realise something strange. This stew, this terrifying, enigmatic, unidentifiable brew, actually hit the spot. Maybe it's the salt, maybe it's the warmth, maybe it's the fact that it didn't fight back. You lean back in your chair, napkin draped across your knee like a gentleman, and sigh. The piano player strikes up another tune. The card table erupts in a cheer, or a threat, it's hard to tell. The air thickens with laughter, smoke, and the clink of tin cups. And in the kitchen, behind that crooked wooden door, the stew keeps simmering. Still hot, still waiting, still watching. It's late now, and your belly is suspiciously full of whatever creatures were swimming in the stew pot just hours ago. You've survived rattlesnake, gopher, and the haunting uncertainty of that chewy greyish lump you're still pretty sure blinked at you. So you do what any proper cowboy does after dinner. You head back to the bar for a drink, and... Not just any coffee, though. Cowboy coffee. And this stuff doesn't just wake you up. It challenges your entire identity. It glares at you from the tin mug, black as a moonless night, thick enough to patch a leaky roof, and hot enough to melt the enamel off your teeth. One whiff and you realise, this isn't coffee, it's a spiritual test. Cowboy coffee wasn't brewed, it was battled. There were no fancy drip machines, no delicate French presses, no cute little goose-leg kettles whispering gentle notes of Ethiopian citrus. No, sir, this was ground beans, boiling water, a pot, and the hope that your taste buds were ready to wrestle a wild animal. Let's break it down. First, you'd take coarse coffee grounds, usually the cheapest kind available, or whatever came off the supply wagon in a burlap sack labelled coffee, and dump them into a kettle. No filter, no precision. Then, you'd add water and place the whole thing over a fire until it reached a furious boil. At this point, most sensible beverages would be ruined, but cowboy coffee was just getting started. Now, here comes your mainstream historical fact. To settle the grounds after boiling, cowboys often added eggshells to the pot. Yes, eggshells. The calcium helped pull the grounds to the bottom, leaving you with a clearer but still terrifying cup of coffee. Some even cracked an entire egg into the brew, shell and all, to act as a primitive coagulant. Others swore by a splash of cold water dropped in right after boiling to force the grounds downward like some... But let's be honest, most just drank it as is and spit out whatever ended up between their teeth. And yet, despite the lack of technique, cowboy coffee was a lifeline. It kept men going on long rides, cold nights, and hungover mornings. It was the fuel behind every cattle drive and stagecoach run. It was also, occasionally, a fire hazard. One misstep and your entire breakfast setup became a pile of smouldering regret. Now for tonight's unusual tidbit. Some cowboys added salt to their coffee. That's right, a pinch of salt, especially when the beans were particularly bitter or stale, could smooth the taste and give it a slightly savoury finish. In fact, this wasn't unique to the West. It's a trick that dates back centuries. Out on the frontier, where beans were often over-roasted, underwashed and likely stored next to the pickled eggs, salt could mask a multitude of sin. Other additives included bacon grease, for richness, and in a few truly chaotic cases, a shot of whiskey. And yes, that brings us to a critical question. How much caffeine did cowboy coffee actually have? Well, plenty. Because of the lack of filters and the long boil time, cowboy coffee often had more caffeine than modern brews. It hit hard and fast. It could leave you jittery, sweaty, and speaking in tongues. For some men, it was essential. For others, it was a one-way ticket to a heart palpitation. Here comes your scholarly debate. Did cowboy coffee actually taste good to them, or did they just learn to tolerate it? Some historians argue that after weeks on the trail or months eating lard biscuits, taste wasn't the priority. Survival was. Coffee was hot, caffeinated, and didn't require chewing. That was good enough. But others point to letters and diaries from pioneers and soldiers that describe the pleasure of a good cup of coffee by the fire. Meaning, some folks genuinely looked forward to it. Of course, their taste buds were also dulled by salted pork and grit stew. So, literally. You lift your mug now, steam curling upward. It smells like scorched earth and resolve. You take a sip, and it punches you in the soul. It's bitter, smoky. With a slight crunch near the bottom you try not to think too hard about. You feel your pulse tick up a few notches, and your vision briefly sharpens to 4K. This coffee could kill a small bear. You love it. And it wasn't just cowboys drinking it. Saloons served coffee day and night, often keeping pots on the stove around the clock. It was cheap to make, easy to reheat, and great for soaking up alcohol. Drunks would nurse a mug to sober up. And remember that hardtack from earlier? Cowboys often dunked it in their coffee to soften it into something vaguely edible. Bread, biscuits, jerky. If it could be chewed, it could be dipped. Coffee was more than a drink. It was a tool, a ritual, a second chance at dignity. Let's take a quick detour into coffee substitutes, because not every town had steady access to real beans. During shortages, saloons and camps sometimes brewed coffee from roasted chicory root, acorns, or even toasted grain. It looked like coffee, smelt like coffee. Back to the saloon now. The place is quieting down. The stew's gone, the whiskey's been poured, and folks are lingering over their coffee like old friends. The bartender leans against the counter, towel over his shoulder, nodding at familiar faces. A cowboy slouches in a chair, hat tipped forward, cradling his cup like it contains the meaning of life. Someone starts humming near the piano. And here's one last fun callback. Some cooks would use leftover coffee to flavour cakes and stews the next day. That's right. Yesterday's brew could be reused in all sorts of ways. It added depth to beans, bitterness to sauces, and a kind of rugged elegance to molasses cake. You sit quietly with your cup, feeling the warmth radiate through your hands. The bitterness has mellowed now, or maybe you're just used to it. Either way, it tastes like the West. Bold, unapologetic. The piano hits a soft note. A stool creaks. Outside, the wind kicks dust across the porch. And here you are, sipping black lightning in a tin cup that's seen more action than most people. It's not just coffee. It's a story, a challenge. And tomorrow, you'll drink it again. You're still sitting there at the corner table, the aftertaste of cowboy coffee lingering like burnt rubber on your tongue, when something unexpected happens. The kitchen door swings open, and a serving girl, carrying a tray with a lopsided grin, drops something new in front of you. A dessert. Or at least, that's what she calls it. You stare down at the plate. It looks innocent enough. A golden triangle of something crusty, warm, and slightly sweet-smelling. Hope flickers in your heart. You lift your fork, cut a piece, and take a bite. And just like that, your expectations pack up and leave. Welcome to the desserts of the Wild West, a world where creativity outpaced ingredients, and sweetness was more of an emotional state than a flavour profile. Tonight, you're chewing on vinegar pie. Yes, vinegar. In pie. It's tangy, it's strangely custardy. It's not bad. Kind of like lemon meringue if the lemon had trust issues. Let's begin there. Vinegar pie, also known as desperation pie, was a clever invention born from the problem of no lemons, or eggs, or sugar, or in some cases even flour. Bakers substituted vinegar for citrus to give it that acidic bite and thickened the filling with flour, lard, and a prayer. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And it was dessert, which meant something out here in a land where dinner might include raccoon knees and coffee that could clean a rice. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Vinegar pie was one of many desperation pies that popped up across the United States during the 1800s shoe flour pie, molasses pie, the green tomato pie. These weren't just strange ideas. They were ingenious ways to create the illusion of traditional desserts with none of the traditional ingredients. In saloons, these pies were rare but deeply appreciated. They reminded folks of home, even if they didn't quite taste like it. And now for something even more unusual, dried apple duff. Sound fancy? It's not. It's just boiled dumplings made from dried apples, flour, and a lot of hope. The apples, often leathery and dark from months in storage, were soaked until soft, and then folded into biscuit dough, balled up, and simmered in a pot of sugar water or molasses. The result? A lumpy, sweet mass that looked like it lost a fight with a porridge. Some saloons even served duff with a spoonful of sweetened bacon fat poured over the top. Think of it like frontier frosting. It gave the dish shine, salt, and that irresistible, what am I doing with my life? Aftertaste. Now, here's our scholarly debate of the evening. Were saloon desserts actually made in-house, or purchased pre-made from travelling vendors and boarding houses? Some historians argue that very few saloon cooks had the time, space, or ingredient to bake desserts regularly. Their stoves were full of beans, stew, and rage. Instead, pies and sweets were often made by local women, sometimes as a sinswoman who ran the laundry or boarding houses. These goods would be sold or traded to saloons to resell. Others, however, point to letters and ledgers showing flour, sugar, and spices being delivered directly to saloons, suggesting at least some places had their own in-house bakers or multitasking bartenders. Either way, you didn't get a dessert menu. You got what they had, and what they had was usually one of the following. Molasses cake, thick, dark, heavy, and borderline sinister. Johnny cake with jam. If jam was available, it was probably homemade from sour berries. Plum pudding, stale biscuits soaked in milk, mashed together, and baked. Cornmeal mush with syrup. Breakfast turned dessert, if you ate it slowly and closed your eyes. Maple sugar lumps, rare and expensive, but sometimes served on holidays or for tips. Now imagine you're back at that table. The lantern light flickers, casting golden shadows across your plate of apple duff. It jiggles slightly, the syrup pooling beneath it like melted amber. You take a cautious bite, and it's warm, sweet, vaguely chewy. The apples taste like they once knew a tree. The dough is dense but not unpleasant. It's dry so hard to be. And that's kind of beautiful. A nearby prospector digs into his own dessert, a molasses cake so heavy it lands on the plate with a thud. You ever tried vinegar pie with a shot of rye? He asks, already halfway through his slice. Fixes the heartburn right up. You nod politely. He's probably right, and probably drunk. And then there's the biscuits. Remember those grim breakfast bricks from earlier? At night they reappear in pudding form, soaked, sweetened, and served warm with a splash of canned milk. Sometimes raisins were added, sometimes not. And every now and then someone would spike the whole thing with cinnamon or nutmeg, creating a dish so exotic it might as well have a passport. Let's take a moment to remember how rare ingredients were. Sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, dried fruit. These were luxury items. They travelled by rail, mule, or wagon, and every ounce cost real money. A tablespoon of molasses might cost more than a shot of whiskey. A fresh peach? Practically a myth. That's why saloon desserts were so often made from dried, preserved, or substituted ingredients. Still, the cook tried. In one Utah saloon, a barkeep was known for adding crushed peppermint sticks to his pudding on Sundays. Where did he get peppermint sticks? No one asked, but it became a tradition. Something soft, sweet, something that made the place feel almost civilized, until someone got into a fistfight over the last spoonful. Which brings us to the social role of dessert in the saloon. It wasn't just a food item, it was a gesture, a rare softness in a world of iron and grit. When a saloon served dessert, it was saying, "We know you've had a hard day. Here's something that won't try to kill you." The piano player gets up now, stretching, and joins you at the counter with a slice of dried apple turnover. He grins, takes a bite, and says, "This one tastes like my aunt's recipe. If my aunt hated me." You both laugh. It's not about perfection. You finish your dessert slowly. The pie, the duff, the syrup. Each bite a little strange, a little comforting. The saloon quiets down around you. The barkeep wipes the counter. The plates are cleared. Someone starts snoring under a table. And you realise, as you lean back in your chair and lick syrup from your fingers, that dessert here isn't about sweetness. It's about survival. It's about making something out of nothing, turning dried apples, vinegar, and fat into a tiny miracle. And somehow, that's exactly what it feels like. The train whistles in the distance, its sound cutting through the dusty silence like a knife through salted pork. It's a sign of life and change in the Old West, a signal that something new is arriving. Goods, people, maybe even hope. For saloons, the arrival of the railroad meant one thing loud and clear: imported goods. Because even in the roughest, dustiest, rowdiest corners of the frontier, people wanted a taste of luxury. They wanted flavours that didn't come from a campfire or a pot that hadn't been cleaned since 1873. They wanted something different. Enter the rare delicacies: imported sugar, canned fruit, spices, even oysters in tins. Delivered by rail, stagecoach or mule, these luxuries were the Wild West's version of fine dining. But make no mistake, they came with a price. A high price. The cost of transporting ice, sugar and perishable goods hundreds of miles over rough terrain was enormous. Often the price was higher than a miner's weekly paycheck. Let's break it down with your first mainstream fact. Railroads were a game-changer for frontier towns. They didn't just bring people and mail. They brought the possibility of fresh produce, canned goods, and even luxury items like coffee beans and spices. And yet, luxury was a complicated word out here. Imported goods were expensive, scarce, and often arrived damaged or spoiled. You might get a crate of peaches from California, only to find half of them squished, fermented, or eaten by rodents during transport. Sugar might arrive as a block so hard you needed a hammer to break it. And spices? Well, they were usually mixed with sawdust or ground up tree bark to stretch them out. Now for your unusual tidbit. Some saloons proudly advertised imported English ale or French brandy to impress customers. Sometimes the labels were real, sometimes they were fakes. In places where brandy was scarce, a cheap local whiskey might be relabeled as French, with a few drops of herbs added. The point was less about honesty and more about allure. A sign in a window boasting could mean anything from overpriced tobacco to stale leaves and a bottle of bootleg gin. It was all part of the show. Saloons stocked canned fruits, peaches, pears, cherries and pineapple, usually imported in heavy tin cans. These were considered treats, often served in pies or added to desserts. But canned goods were notoriously tricky. A dented can could harbour botulism, a sealed jar might be home to a colony of unwelcome guests. And the taste? Well, imagine eating fruit flavoured by metal and vinegar, then multiply by 10. Your scholarly debate tonight: did the presence of imported goods elevate frontier cuisine, or did it create false expectations? Some historians believe that the arrival of these luxuries led to a boom in local food quality. Bakers used sugar and dried fruit to create pastries. Bartenders crafted cocktails with imported bitters and syrups. But others argue that for most sellers and saloon-goers, these goods were tantalizing but out of reach. You lean against the bar, watching a bartender carefully pour a small glass of brandy, probably the fanciest thing he's seen in weeks, and serve it with a wink. A miner clinks his glass, laughs and says, "Here's to the high life. May it stay just out of reach." The bartender laughs back. Everyone knows the truth. Luxury in the West was mostly illusion and hustle. Looking closer, you notice the price tags scrawled on a dusty ledger behind the bar. A can of peaches costs as much as a night's lodging. A sack of sugar might set you back the equivalent of a week's wages. But people bought them anyway. For parties, celebrations, or simply because even the harshest frontiersman craves a slice of sweetness now and then. And then there's the icebox, a rare sight in most saloons. Where available, it was stocked with blocks of ice shipped from northern lakes or manufactured in the city. Ice was a treasure, and drinks with ice were a sign of luxury. If you were lucky, the bartender might serve you a cold beer or whiskey on the rocks. If you were unlucky, you might get water with a tiny, sad cube floating in it. These imported goods also shaped saloon culture beyond food. Cigars, tobacco, and even fabrics for the dance hall girls came in by train, adding layers of sophistication or decadence to the rowdy atmosphere. The promise of luxury brought in wealthier customers and encouraged competition among saloon owners, who strived to offer the best selection. But the reality? Most of the time, imported goods were stockpiled in small quantities, rationed carefully, and reserved for special occasions or wealthy patrons. The average cowboy's meal was still beans, bacon, and whatever the cook found lying behind the barn. You take a deep breath. The scent of molasses, tobacco, and burnt wood fills the air. You watch a woman in a velvet dress take a delicate bite of pie, carefully avoiding eye contact with the miner nearby, who just finished a bowl of stew with a side of bone marrow. The contrast between fancy imported goods and grutty frontier fare is stark and perfectly captures the Wild West. A quick callback. Remember the canned oysters we talked about? Those were often brought in alongside other imported delicacies, advertised with great fanfare and a wink to the cosmopolitan. Some saloons even charged extra for these exotic treats, knowing they appealed to travellers or folks wanting to impress a date. As you finish your drink, the train whistle sounds again, louder this time, a signal that life outside the saloon is moving fast. Goods and people continue to arrive, changing the landscape, one crate of sugar at a time. And yet, inside these walls, things stay the same. The beans bubble, the piano plays on, the stories flow as freely as the whiskey. Because no matter how many imported goods arrive, the Wild West Saloon remains a place of rough edges, tired souls, and meals that defy explanation. The saloon door swings open and slams shut with the force of a thunderclap, stirring a cloud of dust and a sudden hush. You glance up just in time to catch a brief scuffle by the card tables. Voices raised, a chair scraping backwards, and a warning growl that could have been a challenge or a question about who left the whiskey bottle empty. Welcome to the wild world of food fights and saloon etiquette. Now, you might think dining in a Wild West saloon was as simple as sitting down, ordering something vaguely edible, and digging in. That's like thinking a rattlesnake makes a good pet. Saloon dining was an unpredictable dance of manners, muscles, and sometimes knives. Let's start with some basic saloon etiquette, which was more of a social minefield than a guide. The first rule? Don't ask questions. Specifically, don't ask what's in the stew, how fresh the meat is, or where exactly the bread came from. Curiosity could lead to an argument, and arguments could escalate faster than you can say six. If you wanted bread, you asked for it politely, or you didn't ask at all and hoped the cook tossed a biscuit your way. If you wanted seconds, you might have to challenge the guy who got there first, because food was limited and manners didn't always carry the day. Now your historical facts. Food fights in saloons were surprisingly common. Records from various frontier towns mention disputes over stew pots, arguments about who had dibs on the last slice of pie, and even brawls triggered by someone accidentally spilling coffee on a patron's boots. Sometimes it was just a matter of space. Benches were crowded, tables shared, and elbows bump as strangers fought for room to eat. A misplaced plate or a grumpy mood was all it took. One story from an 1880s Colorado saloon describes a heated food fight that started over a stolen biscuit and ended with a chair through a window and a sheriff's intervention. Food fights were a form of rough justice, and often the cook was the peacemaker or the instigator. Now the unusual tidbit. In some saloons, patrons carried their own knives, not just for eating but for self-defense. Knife etiquette was a big deal. A knife placed on the table with the blade facing you as a sign of peace. Facing out was a warning. Pulling a knife to settle a disagreement about the last piece of meat? Well, that was just Wednesday. Some fights began over food but ended with gunfights. Not everyone left hungry. Speaking of knives, the act of cutting bread or dividing a meal was often a subtle power play, and the social etiquette extended to seating. Most saloons had a hierarchy of tables, near the bar, near the doors, near the piano. The choice of seat was strategic. Sitting near the door meant a quick escape. Near the bar meant access to drinks and gossip. Could mean more food scraps. Sitting at the same table as the sheriff or the town mayor, good luck eating in peace. It was politics and food all rolled into one. Now for the scholarly debate. Did saloon food culture contribute to the lawlessness of the frontier, or did it offer a place of order amid chaos? Some historians argue that saloons, with their mix of food, drink and gambling, were hotbeds of violence and disorder, fueled by hungry men and cheap whiskey. Others suggest saloons were vital social hubs that maintained a fragile order, where disputes, often over food and seating, were worked out through ritualized fighting rather than random chaos. The truth? Both. Saloon dining was a mirror of frontier society. unpredictable, and full of rules only the initiated understood. Imagine now a typical evening in the saloon. You're trying to eat a bowl of stew, but the table shakes as a brawl breaks out nearby. Someone's kicked over a chair. The bartender shouts, "Cut it out or I'll turn the taps off." A woman laughs loudly, clutching her pie. A miner argues over the last piece of bacon with a drifter who's just arrived in town. The drifter pulls a knife. The miner pulls a gun. And somewhere in the middle, the cook keeps ladling out more stew as if nothing's changed. The chaos doesn't stop food from being food, though. You eat. You drink. You watch the dance of manners and mayhem unfold. It's exhausting. It's confusing. And somehow, it's home. Remember those mysterious biscuits? They often doubled as weapons or shields during food fights. A well-aimed biscuit to the head was more effective than a punch. And pies? Well, pies could get messy. And pies was sacred. Throwing pie was a serious offence, akin to sacrilege. But it wasn't all violence. There were moments of kindness too. Sometimes, saloon owners would break up the fights by offering free food or drinks to everyone involved, a way to keep the peace and ensure the doors stayed open. Carrying a meal could bring enemies together. A shared slice of vinegar pie was more than dessert. It was a temporary truce. You notice the pianist is now playing a slow, somber tune. The fight has settled, or at least moved outside. The saloon breathes a collective sigh. Plates are cleaned, stories begin anew. The mess is swept up, the spittoon emptied, and the wild night starts to feel like just another page in a very long book. You lean back, your hands sticky from syrup and whiskey, your stomach full of questionable stew and even more questionable memories. The food fight might have ended, but the stories, those live on. Around this table, at this time, they're the best part of the meal. Because in the Wild West, eating wasn't just about survival. It was about connection, conflict, and sometimes a damn good fight. The air behind the bar is thick with the scent of whiskey, tobacco, and something faintly medicinal. You lean in closer, curious about the hidden corners of this smoky sanctuary, where secrets aren't just whispered, they're stashed away like gold. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on what the bartender ate and hid. A world where the art of snacking and surviving went hand in hand with pouring the perfect drink. You might assume the bartender's day was all clinking glasses and charming smiles, but the truth is more complicated. Bartenders often worked 14-hour shifts with barely a break, juggling drunk patrons, unruly cowboys, and the occasional gunfight. Food? That was a luxury, a secret indulgence, a treasure hidden from the hungry masses who might swoop in like vultures at any moment. Here's your historical fact. Bartenders in the Old West commonly kept secret stashes of food behind the bar. It wasn't just for convenience, it was survival. These could include salted pork, dried beef, hardtack, and occasionally fresh fruit smuggled in from local markets or travellers. Why the secrecy, see? Because the saloon was a place where every crumb counted, and sharing with the masses could mean going hungry yourself. Some bartenders got creative. They'd hide snacks in old whiskey barrels beneath loose floorboards or inside empty beer kegs. One famous bartender reportedly kept a cache of dried venison wrapped in burlap, tucked behind a false panel in the bar. Patrons might see him reaching into thin air, but he was really pulling out a much-needed snack. And the unusual tidbit, some bartenders would dip their fingers in the patrons' mugs to test for poison or quality, then lick their fingers for a quick taste. After a long day when no one was looking, they'd snack on leftover olives, pickled eggs, or even the crusty bits left on the rim of a glass. Hygiene was... Bartenders also prized smoked meats, hard to carry, easy to store, and full of flavour. Smoked beef jerky or strips of bacon were tucked in pockets or beneath the bar for quick bites between pouring rounds. Fresh meat was rare, but when it arrived it was a celebration. Everyone watched the bartender's stash closely, hoping for a crumb or two to fall their way. And then there were the hidden bottles, not just liquor, but bottles of syrup, molasses, or homemade preserves. These sweeteners were precious commodities, and bartenders would sometimes eat spoonfuls to keep energy up or to stave off the bitterness of their daily coffee. In some cases, bartenders crafted secret recipes for snacks or quick meals using these ingredients, mixing whatever was at hand to keep hunger at bay. Now, the scholarly debate. Did bartenders have better food than patrons, or was the hidden stash myth exaggerated? Some historians argue that bartenders, due to their position, had access to better food and a more steady supply than their customers, effectively living a privileged life behind the bar. Others suggest that bartenders were often just as poor and hungry as everyone else, hiding what little they had to survive the long shifts and demanding pilgering hunt. Diaries and letters from the period reveal both realities, depending on the saloon's wealth and location. Let's take a closer look at a day in the life of a saloon bartender. It starts early, or late, depending on your perspective, with the first keg tapped, the whiskey bottles lined up, and the coffee pots steaming. The bartender eats little, snacking discreetly on dried meat or breadcrumbs while keeping an eye on the door and the players at the tables. The job requires constant vigilance. You're refilling glasses, calming tempers, and listening to tales of fortune and misfortune. Every so often you slip behind the bar for a quick bite, perhaps a slice of hardtack dipped in molasses or a handful of dried apples. You know the value of a quiet moment with food that's yours alone. And here's a fun callback. Remember the thick, bitter cowboy coffee? Bartenders often reused coffee grounds to stretch their supply, boiling the same grounds multiple times to eke out more cups. That coffee had flavour, drawn, smoky, and with hints of old eggshells and whatever else the cook dropped in. Bartenders sometimes snuck sips between serving customers, savouring the warmth and caffeine jolt. In a few upscale saloons, bartenders might have had access to fresh fruit or vegetables, but these were rare and jealously guarded. Most relied on preserved or dried food items that could withstand the heat, dust, and the occasional spill of whiskey. Bread was usually stale or hardtack, masquerading as biscuits, but the secret stash kept the bartender going, fueled their long hours, and gave them a small one comfort in a tough world. And what about dessert? Bartenders often hoarded small sweet treats, molasses cake crumbs, dried fruit, or scraps of pie crust. These morsels were eaten quietly, away from prying eyes. Sometimes a bartender might share a slice with a favourite customer as a sign of respect or friendship, a gesture that could mean the difference between a friendly night and a bar fight. Now imagine yourself behind that bar, wiping a glass with a rag that's seen better days, your stomach rumbling softly. You reach down, pull out a small bundle wrapped in cloth and unwrap a piece of jerky. It's salty, tough, and exactly what you need. You take a bite and listen to the noise around you, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the piano player's soft melody. This is your world. Harsh, unprecedented, but strangely comforting. Bartenders were the silent guardians of the saloon's soul. They kept the drinks flowing, the peace tenuous, and themselves fed in ways only they knew. Behind the whiskey bottles and beer taps lay a secret menu of survival. Hidden snacks, stolen moments, and small victories. And as you finish your snack and wipe your hands on your apron, you realise that in this wild, dusty place, the bartender's hidden stash was more than food. It was a lifeline. Because sometimes, in the Old West, survival was about what you ate and where you hid it. The doors of the saloon swing open yet again. But this time it's not just another weary traveller or a rowdy prospector pushing through the dust. It's a whole different kind of visitor. The con man, the drifter, the hustler who's learned the art of dining and dashing, Western style. This isn't your ordinary skip-the-bill scenario you might imagine today. No, in the Old West, surviving on other people's meals was an art form, one that required charm, cunning, and occasionally a quick getaway. Let's sit back and explore the wild, weird world of how the broken desperate tried to scam their way into and out of a hot meal. You might think it was just begging, or maybe sneaking out the back door, but these frontier swindles were far more elaborate. Consider the classic trick, the fast drinker. A customer orders the cheapest drink in the house, often a shot of whiskey or a coffee, and downs it faster than anyone else, then leaves a tip on the bar with a wink and disappears before the bartender can ask for payment. The tip is usually just enough to cover the drink, but it's all about speed and style. Some patrons were so quick, they'd order and empty their cup before the barkeep even finished counting the coins in the till. Then there was the switcheroo. Patrons would come in wearing ragged clothes, ordering a small meal and pretending to be broke drifters. Once the food arrived, their friends, well-dressed and freshly shaven, would suddenly appear, loudly declaring they'd take care of the bill. But when it came time to pay, the friends vanished faster than a gold nugget in a pan. The cook and bartender were left holding the bill, wondering if they'd just been played by a travelling con artist. Speaking of cons, some drifters carried fake tokens or saloon checks. basically counterfeit money or IOUs with forged signatures from far-off towns. These could be passed from one saloon to another, buying free drinks and meals until someone caught on. The best con men knew the saloons, the owners, and the patrons are making their scams both subtle and devastating. And now, a historical fact. Many frontier towns actually had informal systems to discourage dine and dash scams. Bartenders kept blacklists, or names or descriptions of known swindlers circulated among saloon owners and local law enforcement. Some places posted signs warning that thieves would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, which mostly meant a night in the local jail or a public whipping. Others relied on community memory, word spread quickly, and a scammer might find themselves shunned or worse. But not all tricks involved stealing food or drink. There were sympathetic scoundrels who'd work the saloon in exchange for meals. For example, a talented fiddler might play for his supper, or a skilled storyteller would entertain patrons for a plate of stew. These folks were part of the saloon ecosystem, blurring the line between business and barter. After all, food and drink were currency and talents were payment. Here's your unusual tidbit. Some swindlers resorted to impersonation. Wearing stolen uniforms or fancy coats, they'd pose as railroad inspectors, military officers, or landowners. With a commanding voice and confident swagger, they'd order the finest meals, confident that their status would ensure payment. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, the bartender's shotgun made quick work of the con. And here's a little-known secret. Some drifters were so good at dining and dashing, saloons paid them to stay away. Yes, some towns had bounty hunters of the belly. People hired to find and capture repeat offenders. The captured swindler might be thrown out of town, jailed, or forced into labour. Others were more lenient, striking uneasy deals that involved the drifter working off their debts in the kitchen, cleaning, or washing glasses. Now, the scholarly debate: was dine and dash a widespread problem, or a series of exaggerated story? Some historians argue that tales of frontier scams were sensationalized by newspapers and dime novels to add drama to the West's rough reputation. Others, looking at court records and sheriff reports, point to frequent complaints about food theft and fraud. Most likely it was both. Stories were blown out of proportion for entertainment, but scams definitely existed and posed real challenges for saloon owners. Let's paint the scene for a classic dining and dashing heist. It's a busy Friday night. The saloon is packed. Smoke curls from a dozen cigars. The piano player's fingers fly over the keys. You spot a scruffy man at the corner table, eyes darting nervously. He orders a plate of beans and bacon, a slice of pie, and a whiskey neat. His pockets are light, but his smile is wide. He thanks the barkeep with a nod, pockets a small knife, and soon disappears through the back door. When the bill comes, there's no sign of him. The cook grumbles, the bartender curses, the sheriff shrugs, and the man? He's already a town over, regaling new friends with exaggerated tales of the saloon and its generous staff. Sometimes these swindlers were desperate men just trying to survive. Other times they were professional, travelling the circuit of frontier towns, perfecting their cons with each stop. And sometimes the line between honest man and con man was blurred by circumstance, by luck, or by the desperation of hunger. Despite these risks, many saloons tried to be welcoming. Hungry miners, drifters, or widows might be offered food on credit or for barter. The spirit of community was real, even if the lawlessness of the West often overshadowed it. The dance of trust and suspicion played out nightly in every corner of the saloon. Who could be trusted with a meal? Who was trying to take advantage? And who would be... You sit back, imagining the tension, the smiles, the glances, the quick calculations behind each order. It's not just a meal, it's a gamble, a test of wit and will, and for some, the only way to eat. As the night deepens, the saloon swells with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Somewhere a fiddle plays a slow tune. The scent of molasses cake lingers, and you realize that in this wild, unruly place, food isn't just sustenance. It's a currency, a battleground, and sometimes a prize. So, if you ever find yourself ordering a meal in a Wild West saloon, keep your wits about you, because the man beside you might just be a master of the art you never knew existed, the art of dining and dashing. The swinging doors clang behind you as you step into the kitchen of the saloon, a place few patrons see and even fewer understand. It's a cramped, smoky chamber filled with clattering pots, sizzling ponds, and the endless battle between cook and chaos. Welcome to the wild heart of the frontier's culinary operation, the saloon kitchen. If you think a kitchen is a calm, orderly place where food is prepared with precision and care, think again. The saloon kitchen was a world of noise, heat, and improvisation, a place where patience was scarce and every meal was a gamble. Underpaid cooks, often grizzled veterans, widows, or runaway apprentices, laboured in near darkness, their faces lit only by firelight and the glow of simmering pot. The air is thick with smoke, grease, and the unmistakable aroma of frying bacon and burnt coffee. You wipe your brow with a sleeve crusted in flour and reach for a skillet, carefully flipping a slab of salt pork that's just beginning to crisp. There's no time for fines here. The goal is to feed a hungry, roady crowd quickly and cheaply. Your historical fact: many saloon kitchens operated with minimal equipment. A large cast-iron stove, often the only one in town, dominated the space. Cooking was done in heavy pots, skillets, and Dutch ovens. Refrigeration was non-existent. Meat was preserved with salt, smoke, or a hopeful prayer. Vegetables came from barrels of dried or pickled goods, and fresh produce was a luxury that showed up only occasionally by wagon or rail. Space was tight. Cooks worked side by side with dishwashers and janitors, sharing pots, knives, and sometimes tempers. Ingredients were rationed carefully, and waste was a sin punishable by hunger. The kitchen was noisy, hot, and unforgiving. And yet, somehow, meals appeared. Now for the unusual tidbit. In some frontier kitchens, insects were an unwelcome but persistent ingredient. Flies, moths, and beetles were common, buzzing over the open food and sometimes ending up in the stew or bread dough. Cooks developed a tolerance, or a fondness, for these added seasonings. Some recipes even called for finely ground grasshoppers or crickets to stretch the flour supply. It wasn't gourmet, but it was resourceful. And then there's the mystery of spices and flavouring. Saloon cooks often had limited access to herbs and spices. Salt, pepper, and sometimes chili flakes were the mainstays. Garlic and onions were prized but perishable. More exotic spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, were scarce and reserved for special desserts or festive occasions. Sometimes cooks improvised using pine needles or wild herbs to add a hint of flavour. The results were unpredictable. Here's your scholarly debate. Were frontier cooks innovators or mere survivalists? Some historians argue that saloon kitchens were centres of culinary creativity, inventing dishes and techniques suited to scarcity and necessity. Others suggest cooks were simply coping with harsh conditions, doing the bare minimum to keep customers fed and coming back. Diaries and cookbooks from the period hint at both: recipes for wild game stews, preserved breads, and campfire desserts, alongside complaints about poor supplies and overworked staff. Imagine now the rhythm of a saloon kitchen during peak hours. Orders pile up, plates clatter. A cowboy demands his steak well done, even though the cook only has salted pork. A miner wants coffee strong enough to wake the dead. A gambler asks for whiskey and pie. The cook juggles pots, stokes the fire, and swears under his breath. You watch as a young apprentice nervously tries to roll biscuit dough, the flour clouding the air like smoke from a gunfight. The head cook grunts approval, then sends him to fetch more lard from the pantry. Everything depends on timing, luck, and a pinch of stubbornness. In the corner, a large pot bubbles with mystery stew, thick with meat chunks, root vegetables, and the occasional bone shard. The cook ladles it out to waiting patrons, nodding curtly as coins clink onto the counter. There's no time for small talk. The kitchen is a war zone. And speaking of wars, the kitchen often fought its own battles. Fires, spoilt meat, rat infestations, and broken equipment. Cooks became masters of improvisation, turning burnt biscuits into pudding, overcooked meat into stew, and stale coffee grounds into fuel for the fire. A quick callback. Remember the canned goods and imported spices from the railroad? Those rare items often found their way into the kitchen, creating moments of celebration. A dash of cinnamon in the pie, a splash of brandy in the stew. For one night, the kitchen became a place of magic. But most nights, it was grit, sweat, and lard. Now imagine you're in the thick of it, sweat running down your back, smoke in your eyes, and hunger gnawing at your gut. You grab a slab of salted pork, Toss it into the pan and listen to the shouts from the dining room. A fight breaks out. Someone's glass breaks. The pianist hits a sour note. You smile. This is life. The kitchen's heart beats with chaos, but it also feeds the soul. I'm sure that's Saloon. And when the last plate is cleared, the fire's banked, and the cooks finally rest, the kitchen falls silent, waiting for tomorrow's battles. Because in the Wild West, the kitchen was more than a place to cook. It was a crucible of survival, creativity, and stubborn hope. You step out of the cramped, smoky kitchen, back into the open air of the bustling frontier town. The sun beats down harshly, scattering tumbleweeds across the dirt street. The saloon stands proudly on the corner, its weathered wooden sign creaking in the wind, its doors swinging with familiar rhythm. But here, in this slice of the Wild West, not all saloons are created equal. Some towns are booming, flush with gold and silver, roaring with life and opportunity. Others are ghost towns, empty shells of past dreams, where the wind howls through abandoned buildings and tumbleweeds reign supreme. Tonight we explore the contrast between saloons in boom towns versus ghost town, how the rise and fall of fortunes shaped what people ate, drank, and dreamed about in these rugged places. In the bustling boom towns, the saloon was the social and culinary hub. Miners fresh from the claim, merchants from the railroad, and hopeful settlers filled the rooms, bringing money, stories, and hunger. Here, saloons competed fiercely, vying to offer better food, stronger drinks, and more elaborate entertainment. Men wore their best boots and hats. Women walked the dance floor in velvet dresses. The piano tinkled, the cards shuffled, and the stews bubbled with promise. Menus in these towns reflected abundance. You could find fresh bread, imported canned goods, tender cuts of meat, and even exotic treats like oysters or imported spirits. Saloons boasted multiple cooks, larger kitchens, and sometimes even printed menus, an ostentatious display of civility on the edge of the wilderness. These places were noisy, lively, and alive with energy. Food was plentiful, though not always good. Food was common, and game was served regularly. Fresh vegetables might arrive by rail, and desserts were a celebration. Patrons expected variety and quality because competition was fierce, and saloon owners knew that good food could bring in better customers. But in the shadow of boom towns lay the ghost towns, once thriving mining hubs that had been abandoned almost overnight. In these places, the saloon was often the last building standing, a weather-beaten reminder of better times. The population had dwindled to a handful of desperate souls, claim jumpers, drifters, and the chronically unlucky. Menus here were starkly different. Ingredients were scarce. Fresh meat was a memory. Canned goods were rationed carefully. Meals were simple. Beans, dried biscuits, and whatever wild game could be caught. The stew pot often sat empty or filled with scraps barely enough to keep hunger at bay. Sometimes a ghost town saloon might have a single cook who doubled as bartender and janitor, working tirelessly to stretch supply. The atmosphere was quiet, subdued, and heavy with loss. The music stopped. The laughter faded. Food was eaten in silence or not at all. The saloon became a place to remember better days, or to drown them in whiskey. Now for a historical fact. Boom towns and ghost towns illustrate the volatile nature of frontier life. Mining booms brought rapid wealth and growth, but once the veins were exhausted or prices dropped, towns were abandoned just as quickly. Saloon menus mirrored this cycle, reflecting the availability of goods and the economic fortunes of their patrons. An unusual tidbit. In some ghost towns, saloon owners reportedly deliberately kept their kitchens bare to discourage new settlers or prospectors from staying. The idea was that a lack of food options would drive people away, preserving what little remained for the chosen few, or preventing unwanted attention from law enforcement or rival gangs. The scholarly debate here centers on how saloons adapted, or failed to adapt, to changing economic realities. Some historians argue that savvy saloon owners diversified their offerings and services, turning their establishments into multi-purpose community centers that survived the bust. Others claim many saloons clung to old practices, unable or unwilling to change, which hastened their decline and contributed to the ghost town phenomenon. Imagine walking down the main street of a boom town. The saloons spill light and laughter onto the dusty roads. You hear a fiddle playing, see women in bright dresses dancing, and smell fresh bread baking in a nearby bakery. The saloon menu boasts steaks, oysters and pies alongside the standard stew and beans. Patrons enjoy an array of drinks. Now imagine walking the same street years later, in the same town, but a ghost of itself. The buildings are weathered and abandoned. The saloon doors hang on rusted hinges. Inside, the air is thick with dust and memories. The kitchen is cold, the stew pot empty. A lone miner sips cold coffee, his eyes distant. Food is scarce. But the story doesn't end there. Some ghost town saloons have been restored, their menus recreated for tourists eager to taste history. They serve stew made from recipes found in old diaries, pies baked with heirloom recipes, and coffee brewed cowboy style. These modern echoes remind us that food isn't just nourishment, it's memory, culture, and survival. Back in the boomtown, you sit at a lively table, fork poised over a steaming plate of steak and potatoes, while laughter surrounds you. The smell of fresh coffee mingles with pine smoke from the fire. It's warm, chaotic, and alive. In the ghost town, the only warmth comes from the fading sun, and the only sound is the creak of a loose sign swinging in the wind. You stand between these two worlds, feeling the pulse of the West, the rise, the fall, and the enduring spirit that refused to die. Because no matter the town, the saloon remained a beacon, a place where food, drink, and stories converged to form the heart of the frontier. And in that convergence lies the true flavour of the Wild West. The sun dips low behind the distant hills, casting a soft golden glow over the dusty streets. You find yourself back at the saloon's threshold, the creaking doors swinging gently in the evening breeze. The chatter inside is quieting down, voices blending with the faint piano strains and the occasional clinking of glasses. It's the end of another day in the Wild West, and the saloon... Now, let's trace the long goodbye to saloons, how these legendary watering holes, so central to frontier life, slowly faded into history, replaced by new institutions, laws, and lifestyles. Their decline is not just a story of business, but of changing culture, morality, and the relentless march of modernity. Saloons flourished during the peak of the frontier expansion, roughly from the 1860s through the 1890s. They were more than places to drink and gamble, they were the heart of social life, centres for news, meetings, deals, and even court sessions. But as towns grew, railroads expanded, and population stabilised, the rough-and-tumble lifestyle began to soften. One major factor in the saloon's decline was the rise of temperance movements. Advocates of sobriety and moral reform, often motivated by religious conviction, campaigned vigorously against alcohol consumption. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these movements gained political power, passing laws that restricted or outright banned alcohol in many places. The dry laws shuttered countless saloons, forcing them to close, adapt, or go underground. Another factor was the introduction of regulations and health codes. Early saloons operated with little oversight of food. Safety was a suggestion, not a rule. But as cities grew and governance improved, laws were enacted requiring licenses, sanitation standards, and fire safety measures. Many frontier saloons, built haphazardly and staffed by untrained cooks, couldn't meet these requirements, and were forced to shut down or remodel drastically. Technological advances also played a role. The arrival of electricity, refrigeration, and modern transportation changed how people ate and socialized. New restaurants, hotels, and cafes offered alternatives to the smoky, chaotic saloon atmosphere. People began dining earlier, seeking quieter environments and expecting cleaner, more diverse food options. Here's your historical fact. By the early 20th century, Prohibition in the United States, the nationwide ban on alcohol from 1920 to 1933, effectively ended the saloon era. Many former saloon owners turned to speakeasies or bootlegging, but the traditional open saloon with its sawdust floors and poker tables was largely a thing of the past. Now for an unusual tidbit, some former saloons reinvented themselves as soft drink parlours or soda fountains during Prohibition. These establishments served carbonated beverages, coffee and snacks, often doubling W. As a different generation, they were a far cry from the whiskey-fooled saloons but carried a piece of the old spirit forward. A scholarly debate remains over whether the decline of saloons was a loss or a necessary evolution. Some historians mourn the passing of a vibrant, if rough, cultural institution that fostered community and independence. Others see it as a vital step toward modern urban life, public health, and social order. The truth is nuanced. Saloons symbolized both freedom and excess, camaraderie and chaos. Walking through a modern Western town, you might see restored saloons turned into tourist attractions or restaurants, places where visitors can glimpse the past over a well-prepared steak and a glass of locally brewed ale. But the raw, unvarnished saloon, the one with the bloodstains on the floor and the smell of tobacco and sweat hanging thick, exists now only in stories, films, and memory. Yet their legacy endures. The saloon's influence lives on in our bars, pubs, and cafes, the places where strangers meet, stories are shared, and life unfolds. The Wild West Saloon was more than a business. It was a stage on which the drama of frontier life played out. It was where survival met celebration, where hardship was washed down with laughter and spirits. So as you take your final sip, lean back in your chair and let the sounds of the past fade softly around you. The piano's last note lingers, the murmur of conversation grows quiet, and the lantern light dims to a gentle glow. Outside, the wind carries the echoes of 1,000 stories. You are safe now. The wildness is contained, the chaos settled. It's okay to let go. Close your eyes. Feel the dust settle on your boots. Hear the distant howl of a coyote. Imagine the warmth of a fire behind the bar, the taste of strong coffee on your tongue, and the comfort of knowing you are part of a long, wild story. Sleep comes gently now, like a soft breeze across the plains. The saloon waits for another day, another tale, another traveller. As the night deepens and the saloon quiets, imagine the dusty streets outside, gently fading into stillness. The bustle of the day's chaos has settled, leaving behind a soft, calming silence. The warmth of lantern light flickers faintly, casting shadows that dance like whispers on the walls. The air carries the faint scent of pine smoke and aged wood, a reminder of stories told and memories made. You've travelled through the tastes and textures of a time long gone, a world of hearty stews, bold coffee, and simple desserts that carried hope as much as flavour. It's a place where food was survival, where every meal was a story, and every bite a connection to something greater. Feel the comfort in that continuity, the peace in knowing that even in the roughest places there was warmth and laughter. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift softly, like tumbleweeds carried by a gentle breeze. You are safe here, in this quiet moment between night and dawn. The Wild West may be wild no longer, but its spirit lives on, in your dreams, in your heart, and in the stories that echo through time. Rest now. Let the dust of the frontier settle around you like a soft blanket. Tomorrow holds new adventures, but for tonight, let the past cradle you gently. Good night, traveller. Sleep well.